Jazz icon Glenn Miller is arguably one of the most famous missing people in aviation history. His disappearance in 1944 is a mystery which is still unsolved to this very day. There have been many theories as to how he disappeared, from friendly fire to espionage. Here, we will uncover the most intriguing of these theories and try to solve the case. During the 1930s and 1940s, Glenn Miller dominated the music industry, writing and performing dozens of musical hits such as In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade and Chattanooga Choo-Choo. Noted for his big band swing and that Glenn Miller sound, the big band leader entertained the military and civilian population alike with his catchy, toe-tapping and sentimental tunes. However, to Miller, this wasn't enough.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When the Second World War broke out, he wanted to do his bit for the war effort, and like so many other show business celebrities, he enlisted in the United States military. At 38, Miller was too old for the draft, so initially he enlisted in the US Navy, but was told his services were not needed. However, in 1942, he successfully enlisted in the US Army Air Force, leaving behind civilian life, but not his music. Appointed Captain Miller in the Army Specialist Corps, he set out to modernize the Army Band, and was soon leading the Glenn Miller United States Army Air Force Band. The band was a triumph and gained instant popularity within the ranks. In 2 years, Miller and his band gave a staggering 800 performances, 300 of which were live shows for military personnel, and 500 of which were broadcast on the radio to millions. The weekly radio show, Sustain the Wings, was an instant hit. Miller's popularity continued to skyrocket. As Miller put it himself, a band ought to have a sound all of its own. It ought to have a personality. And this is certainly true of Glenn Miller's music. On the day that Glenn Miller went missing, 15th of December 1944, he had boarded a UC-64A Norseman at RAF Tinwood Farm, Clapham, Bedfordshire. His plane was bound for Paris, where he had planned on commencing a 6-week-long tour, performing for the troops. On 18th of December, Miller failed to meet his orchestra for rehearsal. However, this was not a cause for concern. It was not uncommon during the war to be delayed. It was a full 9 days until Glenn Miller was officially reported as missing.
Major Glenn Miller, director of the U.S. Air Force Band, is missing on a flight from England to Paris, it was announced today.
Miller's plane had mysteriously disappeared over the English Channel. The plane and the crew had vanished, including pilot John Morgan and Lieutenant Colonel Norman F. Basil. How did the most famous musical star of his generation simply vanish? And more to the point, how is this mystery still unsolved? There have been many theories as to what caused Miller's plane to simply disappear over the channel. The official explanation has always been that Miller and his crew fell victim to bad weather. Flights from RAF Tinwood Farm, where Miller would leave from, had been grounded for several days due to fog. The cloud ceiling had fallen to 1,500 feet on the day Miller would leave for France. Conditions were no different in Paris, with pilot John Morgan's request to take the flight being denied by French air controllers due to poor weather in France. However, according to sources, Lieutenant Colonel Norman F. Basil ordered Morgan to take the flight so Miller could reach Paris in time for a scheduled concert. Miller, who disliked flying anyway, is said to have remarked when seeing the weather conditions, "Where the hell are the parachutes?" Basil is said to have replied, "What's the matter, Miller? Do you want to live forever?" Reportedly, Morgan was not qualified to fly using the plane's instruments alone, and could have possibly lost his bearings and become somewhat disorientated, flying through cloud cover. Spatial disorientation, as it is called, has often been the cause of plane crashes. According to an article on People.com, flight simulation tests have shown that a pilot has 178 seconds to correct this before crash is imminent. Additionally, 1940s planes, such as the Norseman, were susceptible to carburetor deficiencies. This, coupled with iced over wings due to freezing temperatures, could have doomed the aircraft further. Could Miller's plane actually have been shot down by friendlies? Navigator Fred Shaw of Lancaster bomber serial number NF973, based at RAF Methwold, was returning from an aborted raid over Siegen, Germany, with 138 other Lancasters, as their fighter escorts had failed to get off the ground. To be able to land safely, the 138 Lancasters had to jettison their staggering combined total of 100,000 incendiary bombs. The bomb jettison area was known as the South Jettison Area. This was a 10-mile circle 50 miles off Beachy Head in the English Channel. Therefore, this area was officially dangerous grounds to be avoided by aircraft and ships. When the bombs were jettisoned from 4,000 feet, Shaw, who had never seen bombs released before, out of curiosity, looked out of his Lancaster window. As he watched the bombs hitting the sea, he noticed out of the corner of his eye a plane flying 2,500 feet below the formation of Lancasters, flying south. In an interview after the war, Shaw said, "It was obvious that the aeroplane was in trouble, so I watched intently. Then, just before it went out of sight, under the leading edge of the wing, I saw it flick over to port in what looked like a spin, and eventually I saw it disappear into the English Channel." Shaw's bomb aimer also reported the same sighting a moment before, and the rear gunner shouted over the intercom, "There's a kite just gone in down under." Because the formation was not in enemy territory, the crew were not debriefed when returning to their airfield, and thus the sighting went unreported. Shaw never connected the possibility that this could have been Glenn Miller's plane until 1956, when he watched the film The Glenn Miller Story. He decided to check his logbook for that flight and realised that the plane he saw plunging into the sea could have been the Norseman carrying Miller. How could this have happened? Well, Miller's plane would have been taking the Chafe shuttle path, the route employed by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, when going to France. This brought Miller's plane perilously close to the South Jettison Area. As we discussed earlier, Pilot Morgan was inexperienced in flying with instruments and could have veered off course and into the path of the returning Lancasters. However, this theory has been debunked by Roy Brown, another Lancaster veteran on that raid, who says that Shaw's sighting was impossible. Brown stated, "Over 100 aircraft were involved in an extremely dicey action in 9/10 cloud when we could hardly see our own wingtips. Considering that our bombs were jettisoned from an altitude of 3,000 to 4,000 feet with almost nil visibility, in my opinion, it's a ridiculous claim from any observer." Another theory is that Miller was not on that fateful flight at all. German journalist and conspiracy theorist Aldo Ofcotter claimed that he uncovered secret government documents in 1997 that stated that Miller didn't die in a plane crash, but in a brothel after arriving in Paris. Ulf Cotter explained in an interview with a German tabloid that he came across these documents when researching a book on the BDN, the German intelligence agency. According to Ulf Cotter, Miller died in the arms of a prostitute and of a heart attack. According to this interview, the true manner of Miller's death was covered up to protect his reputation and the morale of Allied troops. However, in the aftermath of Ulf Cotter's interview, he rescinded his claims, saying that he'd been misquoted. Instead, he went on to say that he never possessed such documents, but that he'd been told these versions of events by an off-duty member of the German intelligence agency. Although it is slightly odd that Miller's disappearance was not reported until 9 days after the Norseman was said to have gone down, there is no credible evidence to support Ulf Cotter's claims, and to disprove that Miller did indeed go down with the Norseman over the English Channel. Was there more to Glenn Miller than people first saw? Was he actually a spy, involved in the murky underhand world of espionage? And more to the point, Was he murdered by the Nazis? Miller took part in counter-propaganda campaigns against the Nazis. Some recordings saw Miller speaking fluent German for a German audience. These broadcasts combined Miller's music alongside actor David Niven, who was part of Phantom, a secret army reconnaissance and signals unit. It was not uncommon for entertainers to be involved in covert operations. Dancer Josephine Baker, for example, was a member of the French Red Cross and an active member of the French Resistance. Using her cover as a dancer, she carried sheet music with hidden secret messages in invisible ink. According to one Dr. James B. Conant, former US ambassador to West Germany, Miller's mission was acting as a diplomat for the United States, and he was to meet with a group of dissident German generals, including Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt, to broker a peace deal with the Allies to bring the war to an end. Additionally, Conant says that Miller was also given authority to offer sanctuary to V2 rocket scientist Werner von Braun, who later was part of the US space program. It was on this mission that Miller lost his life, according to Conant. This is where the brothel idea springs up again. Miller was smuggled to the brothel, which was actually run by Nazi agents, and he was unconscious, where he was murdered. This theory, although probably the most intriguing of the ideas, does not hold much water. There is little to no evidence to suggest this ever happened, apart from circumstantial evidence. For example, an unidentified British soldier states that he saw the body of an American officer being stretchered from the brothel. He is said to have stated, "We watched as the body was loaded into a GI ambulance. The dead man," an army officer said, "was none other than Major Glenn Miller." However, most likely this is fantasy rather than fact. According to a CBS News report in January 2019, Rick Gillespie from the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGER, says an English fisherman has provided potentially the most solid lead in decades of where to find the wreckage of Miller's plane. In 1987, trawling in the English Channel, the fisherman, who has remained anonymous, pulled up the wreckage of an aeroplane. Having called the Coast Guard, he was told if it was a Second World War aircraft, then it might be a war grave, so to leave it. The fisherman made a note of where he left it, and it wasn't until years later, when he saw a photograph of Miller's Norseman, that he realised what he might have discovered. Gillespie says that if the wreckage is found, then it is extremely easy to identify whether it is Miller's plane, as it was the only Norseman of that body type and engine to go missing during the war. We may then finally know what actually happened to Glenn Miller on that fateful December day in 1944. Until then, we can only speculate.
Please subscribe and support our social media and all that other newfangled gubbins. We also have a Patreon, so please consider pledging on there. Pip pip tally ho and Bernard your uncle.